Welcome to the deep dive, where we take your sources, peel back the layers, and really extract the most vital nuggets of knowledge and insight. Our mission: to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed, maybe with some surprising facts and just enough, interest to keep you hooked. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into some ancient wisdom, specifically from Micah chapter 3. You've given us some fascinating excerpts that paint, well, a really vivid picture of leadership and justice back in ancient Israel and Judah.
Indeed. And our aim is to unpack what happened when leaders, turned a blind eye to the ways of divine wisdom. And then, crucially, we want to try and apply that teaching to the present and maybe even the future. What we'll discover isn't just, a history lesson. It's kind of a chilling blueprint for how societies can pretty swiftly drift into what you might call moral bankruptcy.
Moral bankruptcy?
Yeah.
That sounds serious.
It is. It's where the ethical foundations are just completely eroded. And we'll look at the predictable, often devastating consequences that tend to follow that.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you listening? You're about to gain a powerful, maybe even a bit unsettling understanding of how societal structures can go profoundly wrong when integrity falters at the top. But more than that, we'll see what timeless principles still apply no matter the era, hopefully helping us discern truth and responsibility in our own complex world. It's going to be quite the journey, I think. Okay. Let's unpack this then, starting with Micah 3.1 and the first part of verse 2. Micah really doesn't mince words right from the start, does he?
No, he gets straight to it.
He addresses the leaders of Yaakov and rulers of the house of Israel and challenges them directly. Shouldn't you know what justice is? Yet you hate what is good and love what is bad. I mean, it's not just an accusation. It feels more like an indictment, really.
It truly is. And what's particularly striking here is Micah's precision.
Yeah.
Well, when he says leader, the Hebrew word Rosh seems to imply the political heads, the national decision makers. But then he adds Qatzin, which refers more specifically to those involved in the judicial system, the judges, the magistrates, the ones meant to decide guilt and innocence.
Ah, okay, so he's not being vague.
Not at all. He's pointing directly at the very institutions responsible for upholding law and order. And that question, shouldn't you know what justice is? It's not really rhetorical, is it? It highlights that their actions weren't born out of ignorance. They knew what was right, Micah suggests, but they actively chose the opposite.
Wow. So it wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate turning away, a kind of systemic embrace of corruption.
Exactly.
That's a devastating indictment. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? How easily those in power can rationalize injustice. Our source material mentions that in Micah's time, these judges were ignoring property laws. And it draws a parallel, saying the same issue, leaders ignoring laws, abandoning moral paths, it's still very much with us.
It resonates, unfortunately.
While the specifics might have changed, that underlying dynamic, power, privilege, the temptation for a two-tiered justice system, one for the powerful, one for everyone else, it echoes Micah's condemnation with, frankly, unsettling clarity. It forces us to ask, how far have we really come?
And that's the core of what we mean by moral bankruptcy. It's not just about a lack of ethics. It's like a society's ethical bank account has just hit zero, maybe even gone into overdraft.
All the reserves are gone.
Yeah, all the reserves of integrity, compassion, fairness depleted, leaving nothing but debt and a fractured system. Mike isn't just saying they were bad. He's revealing this chilling cascade. When leaders intentionally twist justice, it's not just a moral failing. It becomes an economic and spiritual contagion. It erodes trust, incentivizes corruption everywhere, and ultimately, as we'll see, invites some pretty severe consequences.
So the insight is that moral bankruptcy isn't just a breakdown, it's often a deliberate choice.
Often self-serving, yes. And it creates these predictable patterns of societal collapse, whether it's ancient Israel or potentially a modern nation.
And this next part, Micah really doesn't pull any punches. It gets quite graphic, almost unsettling, with Micah 3, the rest of verse 2 and verse 3. The prophet uses this incredibly powerful, disturbing metaphor. You strip off their skin from them and their flesh from their bones. You eat the flesh of my people, skin them alive, break their bones. Yes, they chop them in pieces. It really forces you to pause. This surely wasn't literal cannibalism, right? So
Yeah.
what exactly was happening to warrant such visceral imagery?
No, absolutely not literal cannibalism. But the language is definitely chosen for its shock value. It's meant to convey the sheer brutality of their exploitation.
Okay.
Micah is comparing the leader's actions to a cannibal preying on people, like hunting them down and devouring them. These corrupt individuals, especially the wealthy landowners and those in judicial power, were just relentlessly cheating their own people out of their homes, their ancestral land.
Right, leaving them with nothing.
Exactly. Think about the impact. Leaving families destitute, with no way to support themselves. And our source material reminds us about the law, specifically the year of Jubilee.
Ah, yes. The land return.
Precisely. This wasn't just some forgotten rule. It was a cornerstone of Israelite society designed by divine wisdom to prevent generational poverty, to protect the very fabric of family inheritance and identity. When leaders ignored it, they weren't just breaking a law, they were actively dismantling God's design for a just society, creating a permanent underclass.
So that's what Mike is condemning with that shocking language. They were, in essence, eating their own people alive through systemic economic violence.
That's the picture he paints, vividly.
That paints a much clearer and frankly more disturbing picture. So the rich were getting richer by, well, literally dispossessing the poor, and the judicial system was basically enabling it.
Turning a blind eye, yes.
This blind eye towards justice was effectively killing the people, stripping them of livelihood, dignity, their future. And our source draws that direct parallel, saying, the same type of thing is happening even more in our world today, as we see those that have the money and power do not have to obey the same laws as the common man. While the form is different, the spirit of exploitation, where the powerful prey on the vulnerable, it feels eerily consistent.
And this leads directly to a really profound consequence in Micah 3, verse 4. A stark warning.
Which is?
Then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. At that time he will hide his face from them because of the evil they have done. If we zoom out for a moment, this reminds us of a fundamental principle, doesn't it? We can't really expect mercy when we've withheld it from others.
You reap what you sow, essentially.
In a way, yes. The prophet states that those who had shown zero mercy, zero compassion to the common person would cry out desperately for it when judgment finally came. But their calls would go unanswered, precisely because they'd turned their backs on the very principles of divine justice. Our material highlights that we are meant to be a conduit for his mercy and grace to the world, not
hoarders.
Exactly. Not hoarders. This isn't just about what God does to them. It's almost presented as the natural consequence of their actions. They cut themselves off from the very source of what they now desperately need.
The connection between their actions and their future suffering is just unmistakable.
Crystal clear in Micah's message.
So we've seen how the political and judicial systems were, well, rotten to the core. But Micah doesn't stop there, does he? He pulls back another layer, showing us how even the spiritual guidance of the nation was corrupted.
Right, he turns to the religious leaders next.
In verse 5, he takes them on, speaking of prophets who lead my people astray, proclaiming peace if they are fed, but ready to wage war against anyone who refuses to feed them. I mean, this just sounds like completely self-serving prophecy. Their message is dictated purely by their stomachs, it seems.
Precisely. These weren't prophets who were genuinely seeking divine counsel. Not at all. They just looked at the outward prosperity around them. Maybe the nation seemed wealthy, or they were doing well, and they simply assumed God must be happy with things.
Convenient assumption.
Very convenient. They were essentially telling people what they wanted to hear, peace, peace, but for personal gain, for the promise of a meal or some payment. It's like the ancient version of a prosperity gospel, where truth gets exchanged for comfort or personal profit.
And the commentary warns this still happens.
Yes, it warns us that this can happen today. With nations, even with groups of believers. Just because a nation has resources, or individuals seem to have everything they need, it doesn't automatically mean they're pleasing God. Especially if they're rejecting core truths or just failing to genuinely seek his guidance through prayer and, well, humility. It's a dangerous self-delusion that can permeate an entire society.
And the consequences for these false prophets, they look pretty severe in Micah 3, verses 6 and 7. Therefore night will come over you without visions, and darkness, without divination. The sun will set for the prophets, and the day will go dark for them. The seers will be ashamed, and the diviners disgraced, because there is no answer from God. It sounds like a complete spiritual blackout, a severing of their connection to any divine insight.
It does. And this raises an important question for us, doesn't it? It reminds us of the profound importance of maintaining an authentic, ongoing relationship with the divine. Because these prophets didn't consistently seek divine guidance or genuinely follow previous instructions, the very source of their supposed power would be cut off.
So when they needed it most.
Exactly. When the time came that they desperately needed answers, perhaps facing judgment, they'd receive none. The insight here, I think, is that spiritual connection isn't something you can just switch on in a crisis. If we actively practice communicating and aligning with divine wisdom during the good times, we build the spiritual muscles and the discernment needed to hear and respond during the bad times.
So it's the best preparation we can have, really.
It truly is.
Yeah.
A healthy relationship during the good times prepares you for the hard times.
Now, in stark contrast to all this corruption, Micah then describes himself in verse 8. But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord and with justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, to Israel his sin. He's basically saying, look, I'm here to tell the unvarnished truth, empowered by God, and I stand firm against this tide of deceit and corruption. Quite a statement.
It is, and our material points out the significance of him using both names there, Jacob and Israel.
Right, tell us about that.
Well, Jacob often represented, doing things his own way, sometimes through cunning, self-reliance. While Israel was the name given after he wrestled with God, when he decided to surrender his will and accept God's plan, grappling with divine purpose.
No, it highlights that choice.
Exactly. It highlights the profound choice between self-will and divine will. Micah is essentially telling the people that God's justice isn't blind, unlike the corrupt leaders they've become used to. His job, empowered directly by God, is to shine a light on their truth, their sin, cutting through all the deceptions. He's highlighting the painful reality of their sort of collective identity crisis.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this unfold? Micah's message to the leaders in verses 9 through 11 is just so clear and biting. He says they despise justice and distort all that is right, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. And the irony is just palpable. The priests teach for a price, the prophets tell fortunes for money, and yet they lean on the Lord saying, "Is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us."
It's such a classic, dangerous case of misplaced confidence, isn't it? Believing their status as God's chosen people would somehow shield them from the consequences of their actions.
Absolutely. Even while they were actively undermining every principle God stood for.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, they genuinely seem to believe their special identity, their chosen status, would make God just overlook their blatant corruption.
They were wrong. They were fundamentally wrong. They were building up the land through wicked means, literally with the blood, sweat, and tears of the common people, with the rich benefiting at the expense of the vulnerable. And the religious leaders. They were twisting divine words, giving false assurances, yet still expecting unwavering divine support and protection. This belief that God would simply ignore their blatant disregard for justice because of their heritage or their rituals, it was a profound, almost tragic error in judgment. It's a powerful warning against assuming divine favor when our actions completely contradict our stated beliefs.
And the consequences are dire, as Micah makes brutally clear in the final verse, 3.12. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Hill a mound overgrown with thickets. I mean, that sounds like total destruction, an absolute undoing of everything they had built. The very heart of their spiritual and national identity just laid waste.
It was. And our source confirms this was indeed fulfilled later when the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed Jerusalem, and took the people into exile. It's recorded in 2 Kings 25.
So it wasn't just an empty threat.
Not at all. It was a devastating historical event that served as a stark, tragic validation of Micah's prophecy. And the critical takeaway here, perhaps, is that the justice of men can be corrupted, but God cannot.
That's a powerful line.
It is. Unlike human systems, which are so prone to bias, greed, manipulation, divine justice operates with absolute integrity. And, crucially, on a timeline that often transcends our immediate perception. The world's current state of affairs, even if it hasn't faced some explicit judgment yet, doesn't mean divine accountability has somehow turned a blind eye to what's happening today. His justice operates on a different timeline and with absolute integrity. This deep dive, I feel, has really revealed some incredibly relevant truths about leadership, justice, accountability, things that truly transcend time.
What a journey through Micah chapter 3. Seriously. We've seen how a society can just spiral into moral bankruptcy when its leaders, political, judicial, even religious, choose to ignore divine guidance, exploit the vulnerable, and spread false assurances, usually for personal gain. It's a powerful and, unfortunately, pretty timeless narrative that forces us to look inward as well as outward, I think.
And the core message seems clear. Divine justice is uncorruptible. There are profound consequences for turning our backs on mercy and truth, whether we do that as individuals or collectively as a society. It really underscores the vital importance of having an authentic, ongoing relationship with divine wisdom, not just scrambling for it in times of crisis, but cultivating it in every season of life. It highlights that true blessing may come not just from material wealth or national prosperity alone, but from aligning with timeless principles and actively pursuing justice and mercy in how we interact with the world around us.
So here's maybe a thought for you to carry forward from this. Given that these failures of leadership and society often reflect a broader erosion of values, what responsibility do we have as individuals to discern truth and act justly within our own spheres of influence, however big or small? And how do we ensure our personal relationship with the divine, if we have one, is strong enough in the good times to actually sustain us through any challenge that might come? These ancient warnings, they aren't just history lessons, are they? They feel like powerful blueprints for navigating our own complex world, urging us perhaps to be part of the solution, not the problem. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Micah chapter 3. We really hope you'll continue your own exploration of these profound and maybe sometimes difficult topics.